June 10, 1942. Akutan Island, a remote speck of volcanic tundra in the Aleutian chain, shrouded in fog and wind. The sky hangs low, gray, swollen, silent. A U.S. Navy PBY Catalina patrol plane sweeps through the mist, its engines echoing off the cliffs. Below, something glints through the rolling fog, metal curved and strangely intact. The pilot circles once, twice, and then the crew sees it clearly. A Japanese Zero. Its white fuselage lies half buried in the moss. Propeller bent, canopy shattered. The red Hinomaru still visible on the wings. No smoke, no fire. Just eerie stillness. Marines land nearby hours later, rifles raised. The body of a young Japanese ensign lies beside the wreck, his parachute tangled in the brush. But the aircraft itself, astonishingly, is whole. No one yet knows that this frozen wreck, lying silent under Alaskan fog, will become the most important captured weapon in the Pacific. The machine that once ruled the skies is about to reveal its greatest weakness, and what the Americans will learn from this fragile prize will change the air war forever. The rise of the Zero in the late 1930s. As storm clouds gathered across Asia and Europe, Japan's naval strategists sought the perfect weapon for their island empire, a fighter aircraft that could dominate the skies over the Pacific. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was born from that ambition, light, fast, and lethally agile. Designed by engineer Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero defied every convention of its time. Its aluminum frame was stripped of excess weight, its structure thin as a blade. Where Western engineers insisted on armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, Horikoshi's team chose speed and range. The result was an aircraft that could outclimb, outturn, and outrun anything America or Britain had in the air in 1940. When the Zero first appeared over China in 1940, Allied observers could scarcely believe their reports. In the skies above Chongqing and Hankou, it danced through gunfire, slicing through formations of Chinese and Soviet-built fighters with uncanny precision. Japanese pilots trained in strict discipline and aerial dueling techniques found themselves flying the most advanced machine in the world. To the Imperial Navy, it was more than a plane. It was a symbol. The Zero embodied the myth of invincibility Japan projected across Asia. It promised domination of the vast Pacific, where Japan's fleet would need an aircraft capable of defending carriers far from home shores. By the time the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, that myth became reality. The shock of Pearl Harbor at dawn on December 7, 1941, the world changed. The first wave of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was spearheaded by dozens of Zeros, escorting bombers and dive bombers toward Oahu. They tore through American defenses with surgical precision. Outdated U.S. fighters, Curtiss P-36 Hawks and P-40 Warhawks, struggled to match their speed or climb. Witnesses recalled how the Zeros seemed to twist through the air like living things. Their machine guns raked airfields, strafing grounded planes before they could take off. Within hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay crippled, and the Zero's legend was sealed. From Hawaii to the Philippines, from Wake Island to the Dutch East Indies, the Zero carved a path of aerial supremacy. American and British pilots, many with limited combat experience, faced an enemy that seemed untouchable. Engagement after engagement ended the same way, Allied aircraft spiraling down in flames, while the nimble Zeros disappeared into the clouds. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the war's most celebrated pilots, described it simply: "It was as though the sky belonged to us." A war without equals, the first 6 months of 1942, Japan's offensive stretched across thousands of miles. The Zero's long range, nearly 1,900 miles with drop tanks, allowed it to escort bombers farther than any Allied fighter. It could dive faster, turn tighter, and climb steeper. In the skies over Rabaul, Rangoon, and the Coral Sea, Allied squadrons were forced into defensive spirals, their tactics collapsing under the Zero's fluid maneuvers. American pilots gave it a name whispered with dread: the Long-Nosed Devil. Intelligence officers, unable to examine a single intact specimen, could only guess at its specifications. Some believed it was a copy of a German or Italian design. Others thought Japan had secretly developed engines years ahead of the West. But the truth was simpler. The Zero's brilliance lay not in technology alone, but in trade-offs. Every gram of armor removed gave it the agility that made it lethal. and the fragility that would one day prove fatal. The turning horizon. By early 1942, U.S. forces were desperate for answers. They studied combat reports, fragments of wreckage, and the accounts of surviving pilots. Still, the mystery remained. How could an aircraft so lightweight survive dogfights and dominate fleets? At the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, and again at Midway in June, Zeros continued to outperform most American fighters. Yet cracks began to show. Experienced U.S. pilots learned to exploit brief moments, diving away from fights, refusing to turn with the enemy. The lessons were costly, but they hinted at a truth waiting to be confirmed. All that was missing was proof. A Zero intact enough to study. Fate, as it often does in war, would provide it in the most unlikely place imaginable. The frozen tundra of the Aleutian Islands, the forgotten battle in the North Wile. The eyes of the world were fixed on Midway in June 1942. Another battle unfolded far to the north. A lonely, brutal campaign in the Aleutian Islands. Japan had launched a diversionary attack on Alaska's chain of volcanic islands to draw American attention away from Midway. It was called Operation AL, and though small in scale, it would deliver a gift no strategist could have predicted. Among the Japanese squadrons flying from carriers, Ryujo and Junyo, was a young pilot named Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga. 21 years old, disciplined and proud, he flew a brand-new Mitsubishi A6M2 Model 21, identification number 4593. His orders were to raid Dutch Harbor, an American naval outpost on Unalaska Island, as part of Japan's Northern Strike Force. On June 4, 1942, Koga's unit swept through low clouds toward the harbor, strafing fuel depots and ships. American anti-aircraft guns erupted from the hills, filling the air with smoke and shrapnel. During one pass, a shell tore through Koga's oil line. His Zero began bleeding dark smoke across the sky. Instead of bailing out over the sea, a death sentence in freezing waters, Koga turned his crippled plane toward what he thought was flat ground. Akutan Island, 5 miles east. The soft land. That wasn't Akutan looked inviting from the air. Rolling green tundra with long open stretches. Japanese maps marked it as an emergency landing site for pilots in distress. But what Koga couldn't know was that the lush grass concealed a hidden swamp, soft enough to swallow an aircraft whole. Witnesses from his formation later recalled seeing Koga's Zero touch down smoothly. Then, in an instant, flip forward as its landing gear dug into the mud. The nose struck hard, snapping the propeller and crumpling the canopy. The aircraft somersaulted once and came to rest upside down. His wingmen circled, helpless. One reported seeing no movement. Koga was likely killed instantly, his neck broken by the impact. Bound by strict code, his comrades could not land to recover the body or destroy the plane. They radioed the loss and flew back to their carrier. The wreck was left behind, hidden in the fog and forgotten in the chaos of war. A silent discovery for over a month. The Zero lay undisturbed in the tundra, its aluminum skin weathering under cold rain and coastal wind. American forces, unaware of its existence, continued their patrols through the Aleutians. The landscape was treacherous, freezing fog, sudden storms, and near-constant overcast. Few ventured far inland. Then, on July 10, 1942, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina on routine patrol spotted something unusual glinting in the marsh below. When the Catalina crew landed and approached, what they found left them speechless. The plane was almost completely intact. The engine was damaged and the propeller bent, but the wings, fuselage, and tail were unbroken. Inside was the body of the pilot, still strapped in. The rising sun insignia was clear, bright against the dull grass. Naval intelligence officers arrived within days. They realized instantly what they had found: a nearly perfect specimen of the aircraft that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. Orders were issued: recover it at all costs. The journey south recovery would be no easy task. The Zero was half buried in soft mud, miles from the nearest harbor. Crews worked for weeks using makeshift sleds and planks to drag the wreck to the coast. They dismantled what they could: wings, engine, fuselage, then loaded the parts onto a small ship bound for Dutch Harbor. From there, the aircraft was carefully crated and shipped down the Pacific coast to North Island Naval Air Station, near San Diego, California. The Americans now had their prize, The Akutan Zero, the first intact Japanese Zero ever recovered. At North Island, mechanics and engineers began the meticulous process of restoration. Every piece was examined, repaired, and reassembled. By September 1942, the aircraft stood ready, a pale ghost of Japan's pride. Reborn under the American flag, the secret of fragility, as technicians ran their hands across the thin metal skin, they realized something shocking. The Zero's beauty came at a price. Its armor plating was almost non-existent. The fuel tanks were unprotected. Its control cables were exposed and delicate. To those who had faced it in battle, the Zero had seemed indestructible. Now up close, it looked almost fragile, a masterpiece of speed balanced on the edge of disaster. The Americans had their answer. The myth of invincibility was about to unravel. What began as a crash in a forgotten corner of Alaska would soon reshape tactics across the Pacific. The Zero's secrets would give birth to a new era of air combat, one forged from the lessons of fragility. And that revelation began the moment the Akutan Zero first took to the air again, this time in American hands. The engineering marvel at North Island Naval Air Station, the Akutan Zero stood under harsh Californian sunlight, its pale silver skin gleaming, the red circles now painted over. American engineers surrounded it like surgeons preparing for an autopsy. Every bolt, every rivet, every line of its aerodynamic frame told a story of obsession and precision. They had never seen anything like it. The Mitsubishi A6M2 Model 21 was unlike any Western aircraft of its era. It weighed barely 5,500 pounds, hundreds lighter than the American Grumman F4F Wildcat. Its Nakajima Sakai 12 engine, producing just under 1,000 horsepower, should not have made it fast. Yet it reached 331 miles per hour at altitude. The secret lay not in brute power but in its delicate construction. Aluminum alloys, some of them proprietary to Japan, gave it strength without mass. The wings were elliptical, tuned for maximum lift and agility. The ailerons and flaps moved with a smoothness that astonished U.S. mechanics. Even its canopy, small and rounded, was designed to minimize drag. The pilot cocooned at the center of aerodynamic perfection. But the more the Americans admired it, the more they noticed what was missing. There was no armor behind the pilot's seat, no bulletproof glass. The fuel tanks lacked self-sealing lining. Even the control surfaces, the heart of its agility, were made of fabric stretched tight over metal frames. It was speed and maneuverability at the cost of survivability. The Zero was a blade, sharp, deadly, but fragile. One hit in the wrong place and it broke. The tactics of air superiority. When the Akutan Zero was finally restored to flight, test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders was chosen to fly it. On September 20th, 1942, he taxied down the runway at North Island and took off, the first American ever to fly Japan's deadliest weapon. As the aircraft lifted, Sanders immediately understood the fear it inspired. It responded to every movement like a living thing, light on the stick, graceful in turns, balanced in every roll. In his later reports, he wrote, "It handled beautifully, light as a feather. The stick forces were so small I could control it with 2 fingers. For 2 days, Sanders flew test after test, evaluating climb rates, turn radii, acceleration. He found that the Zero could outturn any U.S. fighter below 250 miles per hour. Its low-speed maneuverability was unmatched, allowing Japanese pilots to execute tight loops and spirals that no American could follow. But then came the revelation. At higher speeds, the controls stiffened dramatically. Above 300 miles per hour, the Zero lost its agility. Its thin wings began to flutter. Its dive rate, once thought superior, was actually poor due to the lack of structural reinforcement. And when pushed into a steep descent, the plane struggled to recover. Sanders realized that American aircraft, though heavier and less nimble, could exploit these limits. The Wildcat, though slower in level flight, could dive faster and withstand more punishment. The P-38 Lightning, P-39 Airacobra, and soon the F-6F Hellcat would all capitalize on these findings. Rewriting the dogfight US Navy intelligence compiled Sanders's flight data into a detailed report, the first true analysis of the Zero's capabilities and weaknesses. Distributed to every carrier group in the Pacific, it carried a simple message: never dogfight with a Zero. Pilots were trained to resist instinct. Instead of turning, they would climb or dive, using speed, altitude, and durability to escape the Zero's deadly turning circle. The new doctrine became known as boom and zoom. Strike hard, dive away, and climb back for another pass. This tactical revolution reshaped air combat overnight. American pilots learned to use their planes' strengths rather than match Japan's agility. The once invincible Zero was now vulnerable to a disciplined, high-speed attack. Combat reports from Guadalcanal to the Solomons soon confirmed it. U.S. pilots who applied the new tactics survived. Those who didn't, those who still tried to outturn the Zero, rarely returned. The Akutan tests didn't just reveal the Zero's mechanics, they redefined aerial warfare. They transformed how pilots thought, from instinctive dueling to scientific precision. A fragile legend, unmasked, as Sanders landed after his final flight. The aircraft rolled to a stop, its engine ticking in the sun. Engineers crowded around him, scribbling notes. The once mythical Zero now lay bare, its genius and its flaws exposed. The U.S. had cracked the code. Within weeks, new fighter tactics were incorporated into training programs. Combat manuals circulated across the Pacific Fleet. The knowledge gained from this single wrecked aircraft began saving American lives by the dozens. Still, there was something poetic about it, that Japan's greatest weapon, designed to ensure its supremacy, had handed its enemies the very key to its downfall, and as the test continued, the Americans began to look beyond tactics, into the minds and methods of the men who built and flew it. The human equation war is never only about machines. Behind every aircraft lies the mind of a pilot, the philosophy of a nation, and the courage and your desperation that fills the skies. The Akutan Zero may have revealed the secrets of Japan's engineering, but it also opened a window into the psychology of its pilots. For the Japanese aviators of 1941-42, the Zero was more than a weapon. It was an article of faith. They had been shaped by the Bushido Code: discipline, self-sacrifice, and devotion to the emperor. From the earliest days of training at Tsuchiura or Kasumigara Air Base, pilots were taught to see their aircraft as extensions of themselves. Crashing with honor was preferable to surviving in disgrace. Many believed that a pilot who abandoned his aircraft surrendered his soul. American intelligence officers studying the wreck found personal effects in Koga's cockpit: a photograph of his family, a small charm, a meticulously folded headband bearing the rising sun. These artifacts, handled carefully by Navy investigators, revealed the deeply human cost of the war. Koga had not been a fanatic. He was a disciplined young man following duty to the end. In contrast, American aviators, while equally brave, fought under a very different ethos. They prized survival, adaptability, and ingenuity. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps encouraged pilots to question, to test, to evolve tactics. The discovery of the Akutan Zero became a lesson not only in technology, but in the difference between rigid devotion and flexible innovation. From discovery to doctrine. When the Zero was reassembled at North Island, Commander Frederick M. Trapnell, one of the Navy's most respected test pilots, joined Sanders in analyzing its flight behavior. Their combined reports were unlike anything seen before. They did not merely list performance figures, they translated those numbers into strategy. Trapnell emphasized that the Zero's deadliness came from its context, in the hands of elite, highly trained Japanese pilots operating from carriers. But Japan's pilot corps was limited. Training was long and rigorous, producing quality at the cost of quantity. America's advantage lay in scale. If its pilots could learn quickly and survive longer, the tide would turn. Thus, the intelligence from Akutan became a foundation for U.S. naval aviation training manuals in late 1942. Fighter schools in Hawaii and California began simulating Zero tactics using converted American trainers. Pilots were drilled to recognize the Zero's silhouette, to spot its climb patterns, and to react instinctively with the new high-speed dive tactics. This was the quiet work of leadership, commanders turning insight into culture. The lessons spread like ripples across the Pacific. By the time of the Battle of Guadalcanal, U.S. pilots no longer feared the Zero as they once had. They respected it, but they understood it. Leadership and adaptation war rewards those who learn faster than they die. In 1942, American air leaders such as Admiral Chester Nimitz, Admiral Mark Mitcher, and General Alexander Vandegrift understood that knowledge, not numbers, was the key. The captured Zero became a symbol of that truth. At a time when Allied morale had suffered defeat after defeat, from the fall of the Philippines to the loss of Wake Island, the Akutan Zero offered tangible proof that the enemy was not invincible. Reports of the tests were distributed across the Pacific Fleet under a simple, powerful heading: exploit the Zero's weaknesses. The phrase became a mantra. Squadrons that had once been decimated now fought back with precision. Pilots like John S. Jimmy Thatch, already experimenting with the Thatch-Weave defensive maneuver, now refined their tactics with data from the Akutan Zero's tests. The Weave, a coordinated crossing pattern between two fighters, exploited the Zero's poor roll rate and inability to follow in high-speed turns. It was an elegant solution born from observation, logic, and the willingness to adapt. Leadership in war is rarely about inspiration alone. It is about giving soldiers a way to survive and win. The Zero's analysis gave American commanders exactly that. The quiet shift in confidence by early 1943, something subtle had changed in the tone of American pilot reports. The fear was gone, the awe had faded. Combat debriefs spoke no longer of superior enemy aircraft, but of specific weaknesses, measurable and predictable. The Zero, once a ghost in the sky, had become a known quantity, something that could be studied, matched, and eventually beaten. For Japanese pilots, the shift was devastating. The same lightweight construction that had once made them untouchable now made them vulnerable to even a few well-placed rounds. Attrition grew catastrophic as Japan failed to replace its experienced flyers. Many who had begun the war as aces now found themselves facing swarms of better-trained, better-informed enemies. From the human side, the story of the Akutan Zero is both tragic and profound. Tadayoshi Koga's death, an accident born of loyalty and bad luck, gave his enemy the very tools to dismantle his empire's greatest advantage. His aircraft became a teacher, a silent instructor guiding the men who would one day sweep the Pacific skies clear of his comrades. The bridge to the turning point in the quiet hangars of North Island. As engineers concluded their tests and pilots memorized their reports, one reality crystallized. The age of Japanese air dominance was ending. America had learned its enemy, both mechanically and psychologically. The Zero's legend was beginning to fade, not through destruction but through understanding. And soon, that understanding would be tested in the crucible of combat, where tactics born in the calm of California would meet the chaos of the Pacific Front. The test begins September 1942. A bright morning over North Island Naval Air Station, San Diego. Mechanics step back from the runway as the Akutan Zero, now repainted in U.S. Navy markings, rolls forward for its first official test flight. Its Japanese serial numbers have been replaced, but the shape remains unmistakable. Long, graceful wings, narrow fuselage, and the faint sheen of aluminum stretched almost too thin to trust. At the controls is Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders, a calm, methodical test pilot chosen for both his technical precision and unshakable nerves. For weeks he has studied every drawing, every note, every weakness suspected from combat reports. Now he will confirm them all. He opens the throttle. The Nakajima engine roars to life, propeller blades cutting the California air with a metallic whine. As the aircraft gains speed, it feels almost alive, eager, twitching, light beneath his hands. Within seconds, it lifts off the ground, banking gracefully toward the Pacific horizon. Observers below record every motion, every climb rate, every angle of turn. For the first time, the Americans are flying their enemy's deadliest fighter. And the truth they discover will change everything. Flight without armor. Sanders climbs to altitude, testing the limits. At 5,000 feet, he eases the Zero into a shallow bank. It responds instantly, almost too easily. The controls are feather-light, requiring only the smallest touch. He dives, rolls, loops. The aircraft obeys like an extension of his body. But as he pushes the throttle, the plane begins to quiver. Above 300 miles per hour, the stick stiffens. The once agile machine grows unsteady. The thin control surfaces designed for lightness strain under the pressure of speed. Sanders records his observation calmly. Above 300 mph, ailerons become heavy. Elevator sluggish, structural vibration noted. When he returns to base, engineers swarm the aircraft. They examine the wing spars, the cables, the fuselage. The findings are stunning. The Zero's construction, elegant but fragile, leaves almost no tolerance for damage. Even small hits could distort its frame, making recovery impossible. The myth of the invincible fighter begins to crumble. Unmasking the Zero in the days that follow, Sanders completes 24 test flights, pushing the aircraft through every possible maneuver. His notes grow more precise, turning radius excellent below 250 metapro, unstable at higher speeds. Dive recovery poor, no armor protection for pilot, fuel tanks vulnerable, engine prone to overheat under sustained load. The engineer's astonishment deepens. For months, American pilots had believed the Zero to be faster, stronger, and more advanced than any Allied aircraft. Now, standing before it, they see the truth. It was not advanced. It was optimized. Every ounce of protection had been sacrificed for range and agility. It was not a tank, it was a razor. To win, the Americans simply had to stop dueling with it. Sanders' reports reach Washington. Within days, new tactical bulletins are drafted and circulated to all Pacific squadrons. The message is clear, concise, and revolutionary. Do not engage a Zero in a turning fight. Use speed. Dive away. Re-engage from above. The Akutan Zero has spoken, not through words, but through data. The awakening of the skies, by November 1942, the lessons of the captured Zero were already transforming combat. In the Solomon Islands and over Guadalcanal, U.S. pilots began to fight differently. The once desperate defensive spirals were replaced by energy tactics, calculated dives, slashing attacks, and quick retreats. In the air over Henderson Field, Marine ace John S. Thatch refined his famous Thatch Weave, a maneuver born of intellect and survival. Two wildcats flew side by side, turning toward each other when chased. The Zero, trying to follow one, would cross directly into the guns of the other. It was a perfect trap, and it worked. For the first time, American pilots were dictating the terms of battle. The results were immediate. Kill ratios shifted. Squadrons that once feared the sight of the rising sun now hunted it. The air war, once dominated by Japan's agility, became a contest of endurance and innovation, and behind it all, in a quiet hangar in California, the Akutan Zero sat under guard, the silent architect of America's aerial rebirth. The moment of understanding. When Sanders concluded his final test flight in October, he stepped down from the cockpit with quiet certainty. He had looked inside the heart of the enemy and seen its limits. In a later interview, he said simply, "It was a fine airplane, but one that could not afford to be hit." That phrase, "could not afford to be hit," spread through the ranks like gospel. It changed how pilots saw their enemy, how engineers designed new fighters, how strategists calculated survival. The Akutan Zero, once feared as a symbol of Japanese perfection, had revealed its fragile truth. Its strength was built on sacrifice, and that sacrifice, armor, safety, and resilience, would doom it in the long war ahead. The Americans had learned the lesson. Now, they would put it to the test, in real combat, against the same aircraft that once seemed unstoppable. The reversal in the skies by late 1942, the skies over the Pacific had changed. Gone were the chaotic, desperate dogfights of the early months. In their place came a colder, more calculated form of warfare, one defined by altitude, speed, and precision. The lessons from the Akutan Zero had spread across every carrier, airfield, and squadron brief. Pilots now knew the truth. The Zero could not follow them into high-speed dives, could not roll fast enough to match crossing attacks, and could not survive sustained damage. At Guadalcanal, the difference was immediate. U.S. Marines flying Grumman F-4F Wildcats and P-38 Lightnings used their new training ruthlessly. They avoided turning duels, climbed a height, and struck from above with brief, devastating bursts. Then, before the Zeros could respond, they vanished in high-speed dives, a maneuver the fragile Japanese fighters could never duplicate. One after another, Zeros that had once dominated the skies now fell flaming into the sea. Reports from the Cactus Air Force at Henderson Field told the same story. Pilots who once feared every engagement now spoke of tactical advantage. The invincible legend of the Zero was evaporating under the cold logic of adaptation. The first real victories in December 1942, American aces like Joe Foss and Marion Carl began to demonstrate what the Akutan lessons meant in real combat. Foss, commanding Marine Fighter Squadron 121, used diving and slashing tactics to devastating effect, shooting down multiple Zeros in single sorties. By early 1943, he had become one of the top U.S. aces in the Pacific. Carl described how understanding the Zero's weakness changed everything. Before, we turned with them and died. Now we hit them once fast and hard and left them no chance to recover. The tide of air superiority, once entirely in Japan's favor, was shifting. By mid-1943, the results were clear in the numbers. The once feared Mitsubishi A6M2s and A6M3s that had swept through Asia were being destroyed faster than Japan could replace them. The loss of experienced pilots, men trained for years in the Navy's elite schools, became catastrophic. Japan's pilot corps, which had been its greatest strength, began to hollow out. Every Zero lost now meant more than a machine. It meant a vanished decade of experience. Engineering the counterpunch, while the tactical shift unfolded in the Pacific, the engineering shift was happening stateside. The data from the Akutan Zeros tests flowed directly into design refinements for America's next generation of fighters. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, already in development, was fine-tuned based on Sanders's findings. Engineers increased the dive speed threshold, improved roll rate at high velocity, and reinforced armor plating, directly addressing the weaknesses they had seen in the Zero. The Hellcat's debut in 1943 was nothing short of transformative. In its first major engagements, Hellcats achieved a kill ratio of 13-1 against Japanese aircraft, an extraordinary reversal. The Zero, once the master of the Pacific, now found itself hunted by faster, tougher, and better-informed enemies. Even the Vought F-4U Corsair, with its massive engine and gull wings, benefited from the same intelligence. The new generation of fighters was born not just from innovation, but from the dissection of an enemy's masterpiece. The Akutan Zero had not only changed tactics, it had accelerated the evolution of American aviation itself. The end of an era by the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, known to U.S. pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey. The transformation was complete. The Japanese Navy launched hundreds of aircraft, many of them newer Zeros and their derivatives. But the men flying them were no longer the elite of 1941. They were barely trained replacements, desperate and inexperienced. Facing them were waves of Hellcats, flown by battle-hardened veterans armed with tactics born from the Akutan Zero's lessons. The result was devastating. In a single day, more than 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. American losses were minimal. The once revered Zero had become an easy target, a fragile ghost from another era, undone by the very philosophy that had made it great. The legacy of discovery in the aftermath of each engagement. Captured Japanese pilots sometimes spoke of disbelief, that the Americans had somehow learned to fight like them, to anticipate every move. They were right, in a sense. The Akutan Zero had been their silent betrayer. Back in the States, the original aircraft, now known simply as the Akutan Zero, remained under guard at North Island. Engineers continued to study it for years, its metal frame becoming a reference for every future naval fighter. To those who had flown against the Zero in 1941, it had once seemed invincible. By 1944, it was history, a relic of an old world where agility had reigned over armor, and where perfection had hidden fragility. The tide of the Pacific War had turned, and the battle for the skies was no longer Japan's to command, but the story of that transformation and of how one wrecked aircraft taught an entire nation to survive would echo long after the guns fell. Silent, the next chapter would reveal its full impact, in the numbers, the designs, and the human costs that followed. From wreckage to blueprint in the months following the Akutan discovery, the Zero's legacy began to transcend the hangars of San Diego. The data compiled from its tests filtered through layers of command, finding its way into design bureaus, naval training schools, and intelligence briefings across the Pacific. It was not just a captured aircraft anymore. It had become a manual on how to build and how to fight. At Grumman, Vought, and Lockheed, engineers pored over every page of the Navy's Akutan reports. They studied airflow efficiency, weight distribution, and the subtle balance between structure and agility that defined the Zero. The message was clear: the age of brute force aircraft was over. The future lay in balance, speed and endurance reinforced by survivability. For American designers, it was a revelation cloaked in irony. The Zero had shown them the limits of lightness. From it, they would build machines that could both maneuver and withstand punishment. When the F-6F Hellcat entered mass production in 1943, it embodied that lesson: a powerful, rugged beast that could dive faster, climb higher, and still take hits that would have torn the Zero apart. The F-4U Corsair, another direct successor in spirit, took those principles further. Its inverted gull wings and massive Pratt & Whitney engine gave it the power to dominate airfields from the Solomons to Okinawa. Every rivet in those machines carried the ghost of Akutan, a constant reminder of what had been learned from fragility. The tactical transformation, equally profound, was the tactical transformation that rippled through the ranks of pilots and commanders. In early 1943, U.S. Navy training manuals began to include sections explicitly titled Fighting the Zero, based almost word for word on Sanders's test reports. Pilots memorized diagrams of turning circles and dive envelopes. They learned to measure the Zero's performance not through fear, but through physics. At Iwa Field, Kaneohe Bay, and Espiritu Santo, instructors drilled young aviators in the hit-and-run doctrine. They simulated enemy aircraft in mock duels, forcing cadets to break old habits of turning combat. The once chaotic skies of 1942 became laboratories of discipline and geometry. This methodical shift soon paid dividends. In mid-1943, combat losses dropped sharply. American squadrons began to achieve dominance in areas once considered hopeless. The F-6F Hellcat's kill ratio climbed to unprecedented levels, sometimes exceeding 10-to-1, a testament not only to engineering but to the intellectual edge earned through Akutan, the fighter that had once terrorized. Every Allied pilot was now the template for its own undoing. The human cost behind the numbers yet. Behind this triumph lay a sobering human dimension. The Akutan Zero was, at its heart, a grave. The final resting place of Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, the man who never lived to see how his sacrifice would shape the enemy's victory. His death had not been meaningless, but it had been tragic in its irony. American reports treated the discovery clinically, focusing on measurements and performance charts. But among the intelligence officers who handled the wreck, there was a quiet respect for the fallen pilot. They buried Koga on Akutan Island with full military honors, marking his grave before repatriation years later. For many U.S. aviators, this story humanized the war in a way that no briefing could. They began to understand that their opponents were not machines but men, skilled, dedicated, and bound by duty as deeply as they were. It gave the conflict a strange sense of gravity. Even as they celebrated victory, they did so with the recognition of the humanity that underpinned the struggle. An empire's diminishing wings as the Allies advanced across the Pacific, Japan's air arm collapsed under the weight of attrition. By 1944, the once feared Zero had become obsolete. Attempts to upgrade it, the A6M5, A6M7, and later variants, could not compensate for the loss of fuel, pilots, and materials. Aluminum shortages forced weaker alloys into production. Factories bombed on the home islands churned out aircraft faster, but of poorer quality. Young, barely trained recruits were sent to the front with only a few dozen hours of flight time. Many never returned from their first mission. The Zero's agility still impressed in duels, but without armor or self-sealing tanks, it became a death trap in an era of faster, heavier, and more durable American planes. What had begun as Japan's greatest triumph in 1940 had, by 1944, become a haunting relic of its over-reliance on perfection and pride. The Americans had built their strategy on adaptation. Japan had built theirs on tradition. In that contrast lay the outcome of the Pacific War. The Akutan Zero had taught both sides a final lesson: that technology alone never decides a war. Understanding does. And that understanding was now reshaping not only how America fought, but how it prepared for every battle to come. The long fall of the rising sun by 1944. The once proud silhouette of the Mitsubishi A6M0 no longer inspired awe in the skies of the Pacific. It inspired pity. What had begun as a revolutionary aircraft had become a relic, outmatched and outlasted by an enemy that had learned, adapted, and surpassed. In the early years of the war, Japan's strength had been its mastery of quality. Pilots who could turn air combat into an art form, machines crafted with precision and devotion. But by the middle of the conflict, that very philosophy became its undoing. Where the Americans embraced mass production, iterative design, and tactical evolution, Japan clung to an ideal of perfection that could not be sustained under total war. The Akutan Zero symbolized that flaw. Its very brilliance and its lightness, its maneuverability, its elegance, depended on fragile materials and irreplaceable skill. When those were gone, the magic vanished. Factories once humming with innovation in Nagoya and Yokosuka now struggled under constant bombardment. The few remaining engineers worked under blackout conditions, rationing fuel and metals. The production numbers told a grim story. More than 10,000 Zeros built, but by 1945, barely a fraction remained airworthy. Many never left the ground. The erosion of the samurai spirit in the cockpit, the decline was even more tragic. The elite aviators of 1941, men like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Tetsuzo Iwamoto, had represented a generation trained in the old code, years of flight mastery, precision gunnery, and almost spiritual discipline. But as attrition consumed these veterans, Japan filled their ranks with barely trained youths. Many of them idolized the same legends who had once conquered Pearl Harbor. But they entered battle with only weeks of training and obsolete aircraft. The psychological burden was immense. Facing the roaring engines of Hellcats, Corsairs, and Lightnings, the new pilots fought bravely but hopelessly. By 1944, desperation led to a grim transformation: the kamikaze. The Zero, once designed to outfly and outfight, was now repurposed to die. Loaded with explosives, stripped of landing gear, these aircraft became instruments of sacrifice. Their purpose was no longer to dominate the skies, but to crash into American ships in acts of suicidal devotion. The weapon that had once symbolized Japan's aerial superiority had become a vessel of tragedy, a haunting metaphor for a nation's collapse between glory and despair. The echoes of Akutan in the United States. The Akutan Zero remained a quiet but powerful presence. After its tests were completed, it was displayed for study and training. Pilots visiting North Island would walk around the slender aircraft in silence, tracing its lines, understanding the beauty of the machine that had once threatened everything they fought for. To many, it represented the paradox of war, how the enemy's genius could become your greatest teacher. The reports from the Zero's examination continued to influence post-war design philosophies. Aeronautical engineers cited it in research on aerodynamics and lightweight structures. Some of its concepts, such as wing, loading, and efficient lift-to-drag ratios, found echoes in American jet prototypes of the late 1940s. Even as the Akutan Zero aged and was eventually destroyed in a ground accident in 1945, its influence lived on, in data, in doctrine, and in memory, a legacy written in contradiction. In the end, the story of the Zero was not one of simple failure. It was a chronicle of brilliance undone by its own perfection. It had changed the face of aerial warfare in 1940, then revealed, through its capture, how innovation without balance leads to downfall. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the skies that had once belonged to the rising sun were filled with American bombers and fighters, the heirs of lessons learned from Akutan. In Tokyo Bay, as the documents of surrender were signed aboard the USS Missouri, the Mitsubishi Zero, once the symbol of imperial might, was nowhere to be seen. Its legacy lived only in reports, photographs, and the quiet respect of the men who had fought against it. The Akutan Zero had given America a blueprint for victory, but it had also given history a mirror, one reflecting the cost of obsession, the fragility of power, and the haunting irony of a young pilot's unintended gift to his enemy. The guns were silent now, the airfields quiet. Yet somewhere, in the rusting wrecks of forgotten Pacific islands, fragments of the Zero still lay buried, remnants of an empire's dream and of the machine that taught the world that even the most beautiful weapon can hide a fatal weakness. And that weakness, once revealed, can change the course of history. The fragility of perfection war is remembered in victories and losses, but its deepest lessons often lie in what is revealed, in the quiet truths that emerge when the smoke clears. The story of the Akutan Zero is one of those truths. It began with a crash on a remote island, a single moment of misjudged terrain and tragic luck. Yet from that wreck rose an understanding that reshaped the Pacific War. The Americans did not simply capture a machine, they captured an idea. They learned that what seems invincible often survives only because it has not yet been truly tested. The Zero was beautiful, almost impossibly so, light, agile, graceful. But in its pursuit of perfection, Japan had built something too pure for the brutal arithmetic of modern war. Its elegance came at the cost of endurance. Its speed came at the cost of safety. In the end, it embodied the paradox that haunts all great designs. The more perfect the creation, the more fragile its survival. When American engineers touched its thin skin and pilots studied its faults, they saw both brilliance and vulnerability, and perhaps something of themselves. They learned that strength in war lies not in flawlessness, but in resilience. The Akutan Zero's lessons lived on, in the steel of the Hellcat, in the training of countless aviators, and in the humility of an enemy that learned to respect the foe it once feared. Today, the Zero stands as a ghost of two empires, one that built it and one that understood it. Its story reminds us that history is not shaped only by power, but by comprehension. That knowledge, born of tragedy, tempered by respect, is the most enduring weapon of all. Because in the end, every war teaches the same quiet truth, that even the most formidable machines, like the men who fly them, are fragile things suspended between brilliance and ruin. And sometimes, all it takes to change the course of history is one crash in the fog.